The August heat clung to Hollow Ridge Ranch like a wet blanket. Dust hung in the air, stirred by cowboy boots and the restless hooves of horses waiting their turn in the ring. The bleachers were packed with ranchers, breeders, and curious onlookers. Men in denim and sweat-stained hats, women clutching auction flyers and sweet tea. The yearly auction was more than an event, it was a ritual. But no one, not even the oldest ranch hand in the crowd, had seen what was about to happen. Emmett Cole, 51, wasn't one to draw attention. He walked with a slow, measured pace, leading his stallion, Briscoe, into the pen. The horse was majestic, a deep chestnut coat, rippling muscles, and eyes as sharp as a blade. To Emmett, Briscoe wasn't just a horse. He was history. Raised from a colt, trained by Emmett's own hands, Briscoe had been through storms, cattle drives, and injuries, and somehow had always come back stronger. Today he was the headliner. And Emmett, despite his quiet nature, felt the weight of every eye on them. Just as the auctioneer adjusted his mic and cleared his throat, a strange sound cracked through the quiet. It was sharp, like dry wood snapping underfoot. At first, no one noticed. But Briscoe did. The horse shifted, flaring his nostrils and stomping once. Emmett tugged gently on the reins, sensing a sudden tightness in the animal's posture. Something was wrong, not outside, but inside the pen. Then came the scream. A woman in the front row dropped her sweet tea and pointed frantically. "Look! His leg!" Emmett followed her gaze and went cold. Wrapping around Briscoe's hind legs was the thick, scaly body of a massive snake, larger than any Emmett had ever seen. Its muscular coils flexed around the horse's legs, rising slowly, head lifted, fangs out. A hush fell over the arena, and time seemed to crack open. People gasped. Some stumbled backward, knocking over benches. Others stood frozen, too stunned to move. Briscoe neighed, not with fear, but with something deeper, more primal. Emmett could feel the tremble in the reins. But his own body stayed still. His eyes locked on the snake. He knew panic would only make things worse. Everyone expected him to scream, to run, to call for help. But Emmett Cole didn't do any of that. Instead, he took one slow step forward, and did something that left the entire crowd breathless. Emmett didn't blink. His boots sank slightly into the packed dirt as he stepped closer to the snake, never breaking eye contact with Briscoe. The stallion was panicking now, his chest rising in frantic bursts, legs trembling beneath the weight of the tightening coils. The snake was coiled high enough to strike, its head swaying just inches from the horse's flank. In that moment, time didn't just slow, it fractured. Emmett knew that one wrong move could send the beast lunging, either at him or the animal he'd raised like blood. No one in the crowd dared move. The auctioneer had dropped his microphone. A child cried softly somewhere in the stands, but the adults were too stunned to react. Sheriff Amos Cutter reached for his sidearm from behind the fence, but Emmett lifted a hand subtly, without turning. He didn't want a gunshot to spook Briscoe. He didn't want chaos. What he wanted was control. "Easy, boy." Emmett's voice was low, steady, like a river at night. He moved to the side of the horse, placing a firm hand on Briscoe's neck. He could feel the muscle twitching beneath the skin. He leaned in, whispering something no one could hear. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was a memory. Then, with a speed that didn't match his age, Emmett reached down for the only tool he had, a small worn folding knife he kept in his back pocket. The blade clicked open with a sound that somehow echoed louder than the crowd's breath. The snake shifted, it felt it too. A tension rippled through the arena like a lightning strike before the storm. Emmett didn't hesitate. With one smooth movement, he sliced across the thickest part of the snake's body, just behind its head. Blood sprayed across his boots. The snake thrashed violently, hissing, but Briscoe kicked backward with sudden explosive force, knocking it loose. Gasps turned into chaos. Some people screamed. Others ran. But Emmett held his ground, grabbing Briscoe's reins and guiding him in a tight circle, keeping the panicked horse from bolting. The snake writhed for a few seconds longer, then fell still, a lifeless coil of scaled muscle on the ground. Emmett, breathing hard, stared down at it. Not with fear. Not even with triumph. Just with the heavy silence of someone who had seen too much. Behind him, the crowd erupted. Not in panic, in awe. The fear turned into murmurs, then into cheers. People shouted his name. But Emmett didn't hear them. His hand still trembled, gripping the bloodied knife. Something about this attack didn't feel right. Snakes didn't just slither into auctions. Not like this. Something was off. And deep down, he knew, this wasn't over. The auction was called off. No one complained. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind overturned cups, scattered programs, and a silence that felt too heavy for an afternoon in Texas. Briscoe stood trembling, flanks glistening with sweat and blood. Emmett ran a hand down the horse's side, checking for punctures. Miraculously, there were none. Just bruises. But something about Briscoe's eyes made Emmett uneasy. The stallion kept looking toward the far edge of the field, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, like he was listening for something only he could hear. Sheriff Amos Cutter approached from behind the rail, hat in hand. "Emmett," he said carefully, "you sure you're all right?" Emmett didn't answer at first. He watched the wind roll a piece of paper across the ground. The same breeze that should have brought relief only carried the smell of blood and fear. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah." Horses shook up. "That's all." Amos gave him a look. One of those long, measured looks old lawmen give when they know there's more to the story. "We don't get snakes like that out here," Amos said quietly. "Not that size. Not this time of year." Emmett didn't respond. Because he knew that. Everyone did. A snake that big didn't just wander into a horse auction unless something, or someone, drove it there. He looked out toward the hills behind the ranch. The tree line hadn't changed. But somehow everything felt different. Back at the stables, Emmett brushed Briscoe down in silence. The other horses were restless too, pacing their stalls, eyes wide. Even the barn cats were nowhere to be seen. June Whitlow, the town vet, showed up not long after, summoned by one of the ranch hands. She hadn't spoken to Emmett in nearly a year, not since the last wildfire nearly wiped out her clinic and he'd helped rebuild it in silence. No words, just tools and sweat. "Is he okay?" she asked, kneeling beside Briscoe. Emmett nodded. "He didn't get bit." She looked up at him, eyes sharp. "But you did." He glanced at the gash on his forearm. Shallow, probably from the knife or a fong. "It's nothing." June didn't argue. She cleaned the wound without a word, but her hands lingered just a second longer than they needed to. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dirt, June finally broke the silence. "You know this wasn't random, right?" Emmett met her eyes. He didn't answer. Because somewhere, deep in the back of his mind, he knew she was right. And whatever had started today, it was only the beginning. By morning, the buzz had spread beyond Hollow Ridge. Word traveled fast in small towns, and even faster when it involved a man killing a giant snake in the middle of a horse auction with nothing but a pocket-knife. Reporters had started calling the ranch line. Some locals treated it like folklore already, but Emmett wasn't laughing. Not even close. He returned to the auction pen just after sunrise, when the ground was still cool and quiet. The dirt was raked over, mostly smoothed out by ranch hands cleaning up from the chaos. But Emmett wasn't looking for the obvious. He crouched where the snake had coiled itself around Briscoe and studied the soil. What he saw didn't sit right. The tracks, they didn't start at the fence. They didn't come from the trees. They seemed to appear right there in the center, like the thing had been dropped from the sky, Or worse, placed there. Jesse Boone, the teenage ranch hand, showed up behind him carrying a feed bucket. "You think someone put it there?" he asked, not trying to hide the fear in his voice. Emmett didn't answer. He stood slowly, brushing the dirt off his jeans. Jesse was a good kid, too curious for his own good sometimes. Emmett looked him in the eye. "Keep this quiet. Don't repeat what you saw." Jesse nodded, but Emmett knew better. Secrets didn't stay buried long in towns like this. Later that afternoon, Emmett visited his mother, Delilah Cole, at her house on the edge of town, a fading white farmhouse wrapped in vines and silence. She was already on the porch when he arrived, sipping sweet tea like nothing had happened. Her eyes were sharp as ever, though, cutting straight through him. "You came to ask me something," she said before he even sat down. "I need to know if there's something you never told me," Emmett said slowly. "About this land. This place." Delilah's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, but she didn't look away. "Some things are better left alone, son." That was her answer. Not a no. Not a lie. Just a warning. That night, Emmett couldn't sleep. He sat out on the porch, Briscoe grazing quietly in the paddock nearby, the stars wide and silent above. He remembered a story his father once told, something about old land, old creatures, and things that didn't belong in the light. He'd chalked it up to bedtime folklore. But now, the memory came back with sharp edges. And for the first time in years, Emmett felt something he didn't like to admit: fear. 2 days later, the town had returned to a shaky sense of normal, but Emmett hadn't. He hadn't slept more than a few hours, his mind too full of questions that refused to quiet down. Something about the way his mother had answered him kept replaying in his head. Some things are better left alone. It wasn't just fear in her voice, it was memory. Like she'd seen this before. The snake's body had been taken by the sheriff for inspection, but Emmett hadn't heard a word about what they found. Not the species. Not the cause. Nothing. He drove to the sheriff's office just before noon, sweat clinging to his back from the August sun. Sheriff Cutter sat behind his desk, looking tired and older than he had a week ago. "You're not gonna like what I have to say," he said, before Emmett could even ask. "The lab says it's not native. Not to Texas, not even to the U.S. And they found markings on it, scars, almost like it had been kept in a cage. Controlled." That one word hit Emmett like a hammer. Controlled. Someone had brought it here. Trained it. Released it, for what? A message? A warning? A distraction? As Emmett left the station, June was waiting by his truck. She didn't smile. "I need to show you something," she said. "You remember the old South field, near the creek?" Emmett nodded. That land had been unused for years, dry, cracked, and mostly forgotten. The ground caved in yesterday. Billy saw it. Looks like an old root cellar, or something older. Emmett didn't need to hear more. He started the engine without a word, June sliding into the passenger seat beside him. The sun was dipping low by the time they reached the spot. Dust kicked up behind the truck as they parked near a thicket of mesquite. The entrance wasn't much, just a narrow hole, surrounded by disturbed earth and collapsed boards. Emmett knelt beside it, shining a flashlight into the darkness. The air that rose up from below was thick, stale, and not quite right. Something metallic. Something rotten. June stepped closer. "This land has history, Emmett, and not the kind that makes it into newspapers." He didn't respond. He simply lowered himself into the hole, one boot at a time, the light leading the way into the unknown. What he found beneath the earth would change everything he thought he knew, not just about the land, but about his own family. The ladder creaked under Emmett's weight as he descended into the hole. The flashlight's beam bounced against crumbling stone walls, revealing wooden support beams blackened with age and rot. The air was heavy, not just with dampness, but with something older. Something that didn't belong to the surface world. Behind him, June waited at the top, her face pale in the fading light. "You okay down there?" she called. Emmett didn't answer. He couldn't. What he was seeing took his breath away. The room below wasn't just a cellar. It was a chamber, hand-built, clearly ancient. Dust clung to every surface. Along the back wall, shelves were lined with glass jars, some cracked, others sealed tight, filled with things Emmett couldn't, or didn't want to, identify. Bones, herbs, dried skins. But it was what sat in the center that froze him in place, an iron cage. Old. Rusted. With scales still stuck to the bars. He crouched beside it, shining his light along the floor. The soil was disturbed, as if something large had once struggled to escape. Emmett's stomach turned. This wasn't just a holding space, it was a prison. Someone had kept that snake here. Trained it. Maybe even bred it. He ran a hand along the iron bars, fingertips catching on a carved symbol, a mark etched deep into the metal, half-worn by time. He didn't recognize it, but it felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Behind him, footsteps echoed down the ladder. June joined him in the gloom, her breath catching the moment her eyes landed on the cage. "What is this?" she whispered. "Who built this?" Emmett's jaw tightened. "I think, my father," he said quietly. The words came out before he could stop them. He didn't know why, but it felt true. His father had died when Emmett was 16, and this part of the land had been sealed off ever since. June knelt beside him, examining one of the sealed jars. "Your dad was into this kind of thing?" He shook his head. "Not that I ever saw. But he always warned me to stay off this field. Said it was cursed ground. I thought it was just old cowboy talk." But standing here now, surrounded by evidence of something darker, Emmett realized his father had been protecting him from a truth he hadn't been ready to face. In the corner of the chamber, partially buried beneath the dirt, something caught Emmett's light. A small wooden box, worn and locked. June moved to open it, but Emmett placed a hand over hers. "Not yet," he said. He didn't know why, but whatever was inside, he knew it would change everything. The wooden box felt strangely warm in Emmett's hands, despite the cool, damp air of the chamber. Its surface was etched with the same symbol he'd seen on the rusted cage, that odd, looping mark that stirred something in the back of his mind. June stood beside him, silent, her breath shallow as if she could feel the weight of whatever was locked inside. Emmett hesitated only a moment longer before slipping his knife into the latch. With a soft click, it opened. Inside, there were papers, yellowed with age and damp at the edges, along with a leather-bound notebook tied shut with frayed twine. On top of it all sat a photograph, the corners curled, the image faded. It showed a man, Emmett's father, standing in front of the very same cellar they now stood in. He looked younger, but there was something in his eyes, a darkness, a warning. And beside him, barely more than a toddler, was Emmett. June picked up the notebook carefully. "Do you want me to?" Emmett nodded. He wasn't ready to read it himself. Not yet. June opened the cover and scanned the first few pages. Her expression changed with every line, from curiosity to confusion to disbelief. "Your father wasn't just keeping that snake," she said slowly. "He was studying it, feeding it, training it." Emmett's mouth went dry. Why the hell would he do that? June swallowed hard. Because he thought it was protecting something. Or maybe someone. She turned the page again. He wrote about a bloodline. About how certain blood, his blood, could control things. Creatures. He thought it was part of a legacy passed down through generations. He was trying to understand it, to master it. But he was afraid, too. He said the land was waking up. The words hit Emmett like a cold wind. Memories returned in flashes. His father staying up late, locking the doors early, digging in the southern fields for no clear reason. He used to whisper things when he thought Emmett was asleep. Warnings. Apologies. Prayers. Emmett had written it all off as grief after his mother died. But now it all pointed to something more. Emmett backed away from the box and the papers. The truth was more than he wanted, more than he could hold. "We need to get out of here," he said. But before they could climb out, a low rumble vibrated through the walls, subtle at first, then stronger. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and from somewhere deep within the earth came a sound Emmett hadn't heard since the auction, the slow, dragging hiss of something enormous waking up. The sound was unlike anything Emmett had ever heard, not quite a growl, not quite a rumble, but something alive. It vibrated through the floor, shaking the wooden beams overhead. June froze, clutching the notebook to her chest, her knuckles white. "Tell me that's just a sinkhole settling," she whispered. Emmett looked at her, dead serious. "That ain't the ground." Dust fell like ash from the ceiling as the noise grew louder, closer. Emmett grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the ladder. "We're not staying to find out what else your daddy locked down here," she said, climbing fast. Emmett followed, the old rungs creaking under his weight. As he reached the top, a deep thud echoed below, like something massive shifting in the earth. Something trying to rise. Once they were out, Emmett kicked the dirt back over the hole, his breath ragged. June bent over, hands on her knees, shaking her head. "This isn't just a family secret, Emmett. This is ancient, ritualistic. And if what your father wrote is true, it's not just about snakes. It's about control, blood, the land itself." Emmett didn't respond. He was staring at the tree line across the field. Movement. Subtle. But there. Back at the ranch house, Emmett spread the contents of the box across the kitchen table. Maps, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings from decades ago. Animal attacks, missing livestock, strange sightings. One article stood out: "Boy survives mysterious barn collapse, 1978. It was him. He remembered that day now. The roof caved in for no reason. But his father had said it was wind. That was the first time he saw the shadow, something long, fast, sliding through hay. June traced her finger along a map his father had drawn by hand. He marked locations, 6 of them, all on your property, all near water. Emmett leaned in. "Gateways," he said quietly. "Places where it sleeps." June nodded. "And it looks like someone's waking it up." That night, the wind picked up. The horses were uneasy again, kicking their stalls. Briscoe wouldn't eat. And just before midnight, Jesse Boone banged on Emmett's front door, wide-eyed, out of breath, dirt on his face. "You need to come now," the boy gasped. "Something's moving in the creek bed. It's not an animal. It's watching us." Emmett didn't waste time. He grabbed his rifle, flashlight, and the notebook, stuffing it into his coat pocket. June followed close behind, her boots crunching gravel as they ran toward the pasture. Jesse Boone led them through the dark, holding a lantern that swung wildly with every step. The moon was barely a sliver, but even in the near blackness, they could feel it. Something was out there. And it wasn't hiding anymore. When they reached the creek bed, the air was thick and wrong, like something spoiled was hanging just above the ground. The horses in the nearby paddock were in full panic, rearing and kicking against their fences. Emmett raised the flashlight, scanning the dry creek until the beam landed on something that didn't belong, a massive trail of disturbed earth, wide as a truck and deep as a trench, snaking along the waterline. Something had moved through there. Something huge. Jesse whispered. "It came from the south, near the old oak trees. I heard it breathing." June aimed her own light toward the grove. That's when they saw it, eyes. 2 of them, low to the ground, glowing faintly yellow. Then, gone. Vanished into the brush like smoke. Emmett stepped in front of the others, weapon raised, heart pounding so loud he could barely hear anything else. "We need to end this," he muttered. "Before it ends us." June pulled the notebook from his coat and opened to a page marked with a torn scrap of leather. "Your father wrote about a way to seal the land again," she said. "Something about blood, fire, and the place where it first woke." Emmett's voice was gravel. "The southern field. That's where it began." He turned to Jesse. "Go back to the barn. Get Briscoe. We'll need him." While Jesse ran back through the dark, Emmett and June made their way toward the southern field, the same spot where they'd found the chamber. But the ground there was no longer still. Fissures had opened in the soil, steam rising from deep within. It looked like the earth itself was breathing. As they approached the center, a shape slithered across the dirt, too fast to shoot, too massive to fully comprehend. Emmett raised his rifle, but June stopped him. "It's not hunting us," she whispered. "It's guarding something." Emmett narrowed his eyes, then realized the ground wasn't just breaking open, it was revealing something. A stone circle, ancient and carved with the same symbols as the cage and the box. The final piece of his father's secret. And whatever was underneath it was still moving. The stone circle pulsed faintly under the moonlight, each symbol glowing with a soft, golden light. June stepped carefully around the edge while Emmett stood at the center, heart hammering, rifle lowered. The ground beneath his boots was warm, alive. This wasn't just a burial site or a prison. It was a seal. And now it was breaking. "This is where it began," Emmett said, his voice barely audible. "And this is where it ends." June held up the notebook, flipping to the final page. "Your father wrote that the seal could only be restored by blood from the same line that opened it, and by choice, not force." She looked up at Emmett, eyes wide. "He made a pact, Emmett. Not just with the land, but with whatever's under it. And that pact passed to you." Emmett stared at her. The truth was heavier than the rifle in his hands. From the trees, the creature emerged. Not just a snake, not any more. It was something ancient, longer than a bus, coiled with muscle and shadow, its eyes locked on Emmett. But it didn't strike. It watched. Waited. Like it knew what came next depended on him. June took a step back. "It's not trying to kill you. It's waiting for you to choose." Emmett took a breath that shook his entire body. He remembered his father's quiet warnings. His long nights on the porch. The fear in his voice. With slow, deliberate motion, Emmett drew his knife. "If this is my bloodline, it ends with me," he said. He knelt beside the center stone, slicing a clean line across his palm. Blood dripped onto the circle, sizzling as it touched the symbols. The creature raised its head, tongue flicking, body coiled tight, but it didn't attack. The earth rumbled beneath them as light poured from the carvings, blinding for a second, then gone. Silence. The creature let out a final, slow hiss, then turned, slithering back toward the grove, vanishing into the dark without a sound. The light faded from the stones. The warmth vanished. Emmett collapsed to his knees, June catching him by the shoulders. It was done. The land had been sealed again, not by force, but by sacrifice. Days later, the field was quiet. The horses were calm. Briscoe grazed peacefully under the sun. Emmett stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the wind roll across the grass. He felt something new in his chest, not fear, not burden. Peace. The past had risen, demanded its due, and passed on. And now, for the first time in his life, Emmett Cole was free.